When Moses breathed his last upon Mount Nebo, a hush fell across the desert, but heaven did not fall silent. What men call death was in truth a sacred transfer. One age of prophecy closed, yet another began before a single tear could dry. His body was buried where no eye would find it, for God concealed the grave. The man was never the mission. The spirit that moved through him was eternal. Every soul, when its task is complete, lays down form but not purpose. So it was with Moses, a veil between eras, not darkness but redirection of light. I remember the vision as if it burned through the veil of time itself. The moment Moses died, heaven did not mourn, it rearranged. The Spirit said to me, "Watch, for when man calls something an ending, I begin again." And I saw it, as though the mountain itself breathed. Mount Nebo stood still, the air thick with revelation, the earth waiting for instruction. Moses exhaled his final breath, and what men would call death became the birth of continuation. There was no thunder, no dirge, only an invisible movement, a shifting of divine current from one vessel to another. God does not close a chapter. He transfers the fire. I felt the stillness turn electric, for when the servant rests, the spirit never sleeps. The scriptures tell that God buried Moses himself, and no man has found his grave. But in that secrecy lies a higher mercy. Humanity would have built monuments to dust and forgotten the breath that animated it. So heaven hid the form to protect the formless truth. In the silence of that mountain I understood. The mission was never owned by Moses. It was a frequency that passed through him. When the lamp burns out, the flame seeks another wick. I was shown how divine purpose flows never ending, only transforming. The flesh returns to dust, but the work remains alive in vibration, in memory, in the next willing soul. People often ask, why was Moses not allowed to enter the promised land? The Spirit answered me, because his task was revelation, not possession. He was the bridge, not the builder. Every soul, when it fulfills its measure, must step aside so that the next may walk forward. The law of continuity is perfect. No life is wasted, no moment severed. In that vision, I saw his departure not as death but as completion, a precise turn in the divine machinery. Angels marked it not with grief but with readiness. The hand of God wrote silently upon time. The servant is finished. The mission continues. And in that instant, before the dust settled over Moses' resting place, the voice of the Lord spoke to Joshua, as if eternity had no pause between breaths. I realized then, as I do now, that when a chosen one falls, heaven does not stop, it expands. The death of Moses was never the end of prophecy, but the moment prophecy changed its mouthpiece. And I, beholding that truth, understood how the Spirit works through ages, quietly, unbroken, moving from heart to heart, voice to voice, until the promise is fulfilled in all who are willing to listen. The legacy of Moses was not buried in the mountain. It was written into the current of time itself. For every generation that rises with faith in the wilderness carries a fragment of that same fire. I saw that his unseen grave was not absence but preservation, a divine safeguard against idolatry. God did not want Israel to worship a tomb. He wanted them to walk toward destiny. The promised land could not be entered by the one who revealed the law, for the law brings knowledge of sin, but only grace brings entrance. Moses stood for revelation, Joshua for fulfillment. One prepares the way, the other carries the people through. The rhythm of heaven is always succession, never stagnation. The Lord hides his servants when their work is done, so that his glory may not be confined to a name or face. I felt in that vision that even now, across centuries, the Spirit continues to move through new vessels, different names, same breath. The mantle of Moses was not folded in the dust. It hovered, waiting for faith to reach upward and claim it. I saw that the same Spirit that burned in the bush and thundered from Sinai would one day whisper in the upper room, turning tongues of fire upon fishermen. Nothing of God is ever lost. It only changes form to meet the need of the hour. The desert of Nebo became a gateway for continuity, the moment where mortality handed the torch to immortality. And so it is with all who are called. None truly die. They only dissolve into the larger will of God. As I looked upon that mountain in my vision, I heard a voice like many waters say, "My servants do not vanish. They become part of the wind that carries my word." Then I understood. Death to the righteous is not departure, but distribution. Their essence becomes scattered across the timeline of faith, seeding courage, wisdom, and remembrance wherever hearts remain open. Moses' passing was not an end, but a multiplication. In every generation that dares to climb its own Nebo, to stand between promise and fulfillment, the same unseen hand buries the past and births the future. I felt the echo of that moment ripple through creation, the eternal rhythm of completion and beginning intertwined. Heaven does not measure time as we do. What we call death, it calls transition. And so the fire continues, unquenched, unowned, moving onward in search of the next vessel ready to carry its flame. That same night, another voice awoke not to the elders or priests, but to Joshua, the quiet assistant, who had watched in silence for 40 years. "Arise, go over this Jordan," said the Lord. There was no counsel, no mourning period. God does not linger in the tombs of yesterday. Joshua had been prepared in shadows, refined by waiting. The spirit of wisdom already rested on him. In that instant, divine succession was revealed. Not promotion, but transference. One man fell, another rose, and the purpose of heaven did not pause. I tell you, the moment the breath left Moses, another voice began to stir across the camp, low as a whisper, then rising like a tide. It did not speak to the elders, nor to the priests, nor to those who once sat nearest the fire of counsel. It spoke to the one who had waited the longest in silence, Joshua, son of Nun, the faithful shadow who had followed the prophet into the mountains and guarded the tent when others turned away. The Spirit said to me, "Do you see, Edgar, this is how heaven moves. It chooses not the loud, but the listening." Joshua did not seek command. He sought presence, and because of that, command sought him. I watched as light gathered around his tent, the same kind of light that had once surrounded the bush that burned but was not consumed. And within that glow came the word, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I give them." The earth itself seemed to hold its breath, for the shift was immediate. No counsel, no delay, no funeral. The Spirit of God does not pause to mourn. It flows forward like the river it made. And there, within that tent, I saw Joshua tremble, not with fear, but with the weight of the unseen. He had lived decades under the mantle of another man's greatness, content to serve, to watch, to learn. He had been trained not by comfort, but by proximity to divine fire. I could feel his memories, the long nights guarding the tent of meeting when the cloud descended and the people slept, the quiet voice within him whispering, "Stay, watch, listen." I realized then that preparation in the eyes of heaven rarely looks like promotion in the eyes of men. Moses had been the thunder. Joshua was the echo, shaped slowly, faithfully, until the moment heaven needed a steady hand to carry the next command. The Spirit said this was no accident, no sudden appointment. The oil was already poured, only waiting for the vessel to be ready. And as the vision widened, I saw how the transfer occurred not by ceremony, but by impartation. Moses had once laid his hands upon Joshua, and I saw that act ripple through time like electricity across a wire, unseen yet powerful. The spirit of wisdom entered him, and when the elder fell, the current found its next conductor. This is the hidden order behind succession. God does not lose power when a leader falls. He multiplies it through obedience. I watched Joshua rise from his knees, his face still pale from the encounter, yet his eyes clear as polished stone. He stepped out of the tent into a camp, unaware that destiny had already changed hands. The people continued their mourning, but the heavens had already spoken. "Arise," the word had said, and Joshua obeyed. Obedience, not readiness, is what heaven counts. For no man is ever ready to carry the weight of divine will. He is simply willing. I saw angels mark that obedience like a seal, hovering above his path. Then came the next revelation, sharper than any sword. The Spirit told him that the promise remained unchanged, that every place his foot would tread had already been given. already given not will be but is. Such is the language of heaven. It speaks in completion even when the journey has just begun. I could sense Joshua's heart wrestling with the task. He had seen the promised land before, years earlier, when the others lost courage and turned back. He knew the giants, the walls, the uncertainty, and yet the voice offered no explanation, only presence. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. It was not strategy that God offered, but companionship. I felt that truth pierced through me like heat. The power of heaven is never in knowledge, but in nearness. Joshua understood this at once. His courage came not from plans, but from the certainty that he was not alone. In the stillness I heard a pattern repeating itself from ages past, the same assurance given to Abraham when he left his home, to Jacob when he fled into the wilderness, to Moses at the burning bush. Each chosen vessel is told the same secret: I am with you. That phrase, small in words but infinite in depth, is the entire structure upon which destiny stands. The Spirit revealed that Joshua's calling was not to manage the wilderness, but to end it. Moses had led them out of bondage. Joshua would lead them into promise. One was the deliverer, the other the conqueror. The roles were different, but the source was one. I saw how heaven arranges these handoffs like perfect gears in a divine clock, each turning when the other completes its circle. Time does not rule God. God rules time. When a leader's purpose fulfills its measure, the Spirit does not seek another of equal fame, but of equal faith. Joshua was such a man, humble enough to inherit power without pride. And as I watched, I understood how this moment applies to every soul. We are each Joshua when life calls us to rise after something sacred has ended. The mentor, the chapter, the comfort dies, and we are told, now therefore arise. Most resist, waiting to feel ready, waiting for the old to return. But heaven does not repeat what it has completed. It continues. The promise of Moses was meant to flow through Joshua, just as truth flows through every heart willing to continue what faith begins. The Spirit said, every generation has its Jordan, every soul its call to cross. And as the vision faded, I realized that divine succession is not a story of replacement, but of rhythm. God never loses continuity. He simply changes the instrument through which the same melody is played. Joshua did not inherit Moses' power, he inherited his purpose. And that purpose, as eternal as the breath of the Almighty, would not rest until the promise stood fulfilled beneath a new Sunday. Joshua did not stand before an army, he stood before an impossibility, and yet the command was absolute. There were no negotiations, no explanations, no maps of the territory ahead, only a single directive spoken with the authority of eternity. Arise, cross, led. The words burned like fire in the silence of his tent. I saw his hands tremble, not from weakness, but from awe, because he understood the weight of divine expectation. God had not come to soothe him, but to summon him. Heaven offers no comfort when destiny is at stake. It offers command. The task was beyond any man's reach, to lead 600,000 souls, not counting women and children, across a raging river into a land fortified by giants. No training could prepare him, no precedent could guide him, for Moses had not taught him how to conquer, only how to trust. And that was precisely the point. The Spirit told me as I watched the vision unfold, faith is not built in explanation, but in execution. The divine will is not concerned with how you feel. It is concerned with whether you move. Joshua stood in that tension where every servant of God eventually stands, between the comfort of the known and the call of the unseen. The human mind demands a plan, but heaven responds only with presence. God said, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. That was not a repetition of words, but a transfer of essence. The same presence that burned in the bush, that thundered on Sinai, now whispered in his heart. This was no inheritance of authority, but of alignment. Moses had learned to follow the cloud. Joshua was asked to carry it forward. I saw that the command was not about conquest, but about cooperation with the invisible. When man aligns with divine rhythm, what seems impossible dissolves into obedience. The Spirit explained that divine timing never waits for human readiness. The moment the word is spoken, creation itself adjusts to fulfill it. The river begins to part the moment the command is received, not when the foot touches the water. Heaven moves at the speed of willingness. Joshua's courage, therefore, was not a matter of emotion but of decision. He did not need to feel brave. He needed to act in faith. This is the law of manifestation in divine purpose. Obedience precedes revelation. I was shown the thoughts that moved through his mind. He remembered the spies, the fear, the 40 years of wandering born from unbelief. He understood what hesitation costs. To delay divine instruction is to choose exile. Joshua resolved within himself that this generation would not repeat the mistake of their fathers. He looked toward the Jordan not as an obstacle but as a mirror. The river represented the threshold between memory and destiny, between the comfort of survival and the risk of promise. And as I beheld this moment, I realized that every soul faces its own Jordan. There is always a line where what has been must yield to what will be, and the command always comes before the assurance. The Spirit whispered, "It is not your strength I require, but your surrender." God's commands are rarely reasonable because they are designed to draw out the divine capacity within the human vessel. The impossible is heaven's invitation to partnership. Joshua, standing alone in the moonlight, carried not a sword, but a word, and that word carried the full momentum of divine will. The promise was not that the battle would be easy, but that his steps would be guided. Every place the sole of his foot would tread was already given. That phrase, already given, became the cornerstone of his faith. It taught him that destiny is not achieved, it is entered. What is promised is not earned, but received through alignment. I saw in his spirit the birth of certainty, not the shallow certainty of arrogance, but the deep confidence of one who knows he is walking within a prepared design. Heaven's architecture is completed before man begins his journey. The command was simple, but it required complete internal rearrangement. Joshua had to shift from the consciousness of following to the consciousness of leading. The same humility that kept him loyal to Moses now had to sustain him under the weight of command. Leadership in divine order is never about superiority. It is about resonance. He had to vibrate at the same frequency as the presence that called him. As I watched this unfold, the Spirit said, "When man ceases to depend on strength, the Spirit takes command through him. That is the secret behind every miracle. Surrender is power disguised as stillness." Joshua would soon face walls higher than any logic could explain, but even now, before one step was taken, victory was seeded in obedience. Faith had already conquered what his eyes had yet to see, and I understood then that God never calls a man to a possible task. The command of heaven is always beyond human strength, because it is designed to awaken divine partnership. The impossible is not punishment, it is proof that heaven intends to participate. Joshua's fear did not disqualify him. It invited grace. The trembling hand that still moves forward is mightier than the confident one that hesitates. I could feel the presence of angels around him, not promising ease, but confirming alignment. The Spirit of God does not reward certainty, it rewards movement. And as Joshua rose from the ground, his heart steady, though his mind still uncertain, the air itself seemed to shift. The covenant of leadership had been activated. The mantle of Moses had become motion within Joshua's veins. The wilderness was over, the waiting was done, and the voice of eternity echoed through his spirit, sharp and final. "Be strong and of good courage. Do not fear, for I am with you." And in that command lay the entire mystery of divine strength, man's limitation, becoming the instrument through which God reveals his limitless power. Israel answered Joshua with one voice, "All that you command we will do." These were the children of the wanderers. They had buried both their fathers and their fears. Complaint had become discipline. Pride had become reverence. They obeyed not the man, but the divine order moving through him. The wilderness had been their school. The lesson was simple. Rebellion delays destiny. Obedience opens it. When life appoints a new guide, follow the current of truth, not the personality steering it. I saw the camp of Israel shrouded in twilight, the smoke of their fires curling upward as if to carry the memory of Moses toward the unseen heavens. Yet within that stillness the Spirit stirred with new urgency. It was shown to me that when God appoints a new leader, The order of heaven reshapes itself, and the hearts of men are tested. Joshua stood before a multitude, restless and uncertain, their faith worn thin by years of wandering, their courage tempered by loss. I heard the murmuring of the tribes, faint as wind through dry reeds, asking who now would speak for God, who now would bear the staff of miracles. And as their question rose, the answer came not from man, but from heaven itself. The voice that had once thundered upon Sinai now whispered across the soul of the nation. It was the hour of testing. The Spirit said to me, Edgar, observe the law of succession in divine order, for when the messenger departs, the message must rise in another vessel. I beheld Joshua step forth from the shadows, his countenance grave yet steady, and though no crown adorned his head, nor robe distinguished him from the others, authority clothed him like invisible fire. The tribes gathered, the elders bowed their faces to the earth, and the people, remembering the wrath that had consumed those who rebelled against Moses, answered with one voice, All that thou commandest us we will do, and whithersoever thou sendest us we will go. Their words rang with the solemnity of covenant, and I understood that obedience is the foundation upon which divine order rests. They did not bow to Joshua's flesh, but to the Spirit moving through him, for the wilderness had taught them what disobedience costs. I could feel the weight of history pressing upon that moment, the ghosts of those who had fallen for murmuring, their bones scattered across the desert as witnesses of rebellion. Now a new generation stood ready, purified by hardship, sharpened by hunger, desperate to enter the promise that their fathers had forfeited. The Spirit whispered, This is the rhythm of regeneration, the cycle through which humanity learns that faith without obedience is barren. I watched their faces illuminated by firelight, and in their eyes burned a new resolve. No longer would they question the appointed hand of God. No longer would they delay destiny through fear. Unity, fierce and solemn, bound them tighter than any chain of iron. I realized then that divine governance does not flow through democracy, but through alignment with the eternal will. When heaven decrees, the earth must consent, for resistance only multiplies the wandering. Joshua spoke little, for the Spirit within him spoke louder than words. His authority was not loud, but luminous. The people felt it as one feels the nearness of lightning before it strikes. They were drawn to his command, not through persuasion, but through recognition. Their spirits knew the vibration of divine order. I was told, in every age, there must come a moment when men cease to debate what heaven has already decided. Joshua's moment had come, and Israel, weary of their own opinions, surrendered to direction. I saw the wisdom in this design. Before the people could conquer the land, they had to conquer division. Before they could take the walls of Jericho, they had to tear down the walls between themselves. The Spirit said, Unity is the first miracle of victory. I sense that truth echo through eternity, for no promise is entered through rebellion, and no leader can stand unless the hearts of those he leads are joined in purpose. The oath they swore that night was not mere ritual. It was the sealing of a collective consciousness into one intent. I heard Joshua answer them, his voice calm yet edged with fire, saying, Only be strong and courageous. And I knew that courage in that moment meant obedience without question, faith without condition. I saw angels mark that covenant with invisible flame above the assembly, recording it in the unseen records where every vow of the soul is kept. As the vision deepened, I understood that the people's submission was not weakness, but readiness. They had learned that freedom without discipline breeds chaos, and discipline aligned with God breeds destiny. The wilderness had purged them of idolatry, of self-will, of complaint. They had learned to hear not the noise of circumstance, but the still, small voice within. That is why they followed Joshua without hesitation, for they had come to trust the pattern of God even when they could not see the plan. And as the stars rose above the camp, shimmering like promises deferred but not forgotten, the Spirit spoke once more. When the hearts of men align in obedience, the heavens open, and miracles begin to prepare themselves. Then I saw movement above the Jordan, faint yet certain, a trembling in the waters as though the river itself awaited instruction. Destiny was already stirring. The unity of the people had set heaven in motion, and though the night was calm, I knew that by dawn the earth itself would remember the power that once split the sea. As the priests bearing the ark stepped into the flooded Jordan, the waters halted and rose in a heap. The miracle of the Red Sea repeated, but transformed. The first crossing freed them from bondage. This one carried them into inheritance. The waters did not part until faith stepped first. Heaven confirms what courage begins. Every generation must witness its own wonder, or memory turns to myth. The same spirit that divided seas now divides doubt from belief. The river waited for faith, not for strength. I saw the Jordan swollen with harvest floods, its current violent and cold, its surface glinting like tempered steel beneath the dawn. God had spoken, and now the command demanded proof. The priests bearing the ark stepped forward, and all of Israel held its breath. There were no bridges, no boats, no logic, only a promise spoken in eternity. I felt the tremor in the air. That silence before the supernatural breaks the rules of nature. The Spirit said to me, "Watch, for heaven does not move until the first foot moves." The priests advanced, the soles of their feet met the edge of the waters, and in that instant, creation obeyed the Creator. The river split. The current halted as though arrested by invisible hands, and the waters stood upright like walls of glass, gleaming under the Sunday. Dry ground appeared, as if time itself had been peeled back to the first day of order. I saw it as clearly as I see you now. The impossible became pathway. This was not repetition of the Red Sea. It was confirmation that divine power had not departed with Moses. God was speaking without words, saying, "My presence has not changed, only the instrument through which I reveal it." The priests stood firm in the middle of the river, holding the ark, the symbol of covenant, high above their heads, while the nation passed through. Their obedience became the bridge between promise and fulfillment. The Spirit whispered, "Faith must step before sight, for heaven waits upon the courage of those who carry its presence." Each tribe crossed, each child's foot touched the riverbed that moments before had been death, and I felt the unseen realm rejoice. I understood then that faith is not belief in words, but motion toward the unseen. Joshua had not parted the waters with gesture or staff. He had parted them through alignment. God confirms leadership not by title, but by trust. I saw the people look upon Joshua as they once looked upon Moses, awe dawning in their faces, fear turning to reverence. Heaven had validated him. The mantle was no longer rumor, it was revelation. The Spirit said, "Divine legitimacy is never inherited through lineage, but through obedience proven under pressure." That day, Joshua became more than a successor. He became a sign that the living God walks continually among his people. When the last man had crossed, Joshua commanded 12 stones to be taken from the riverbed and placed upon the shore as a memorial. The meaning was profound. Memory preserves faith, and faith preserved becomes law in the Spirit. I was told, every miracle requires witness, for the human heart forgets quickly when comfort returns. Those stones were more than monuments. They were frequencies of remembrance, resonating with the vibration of obedience. I felt the energy of the moment ripple outward through time, reaching even into the hearts of those who would read this account centuries later. The Jordan's parting was not about geography, but about consciousness. The people had to cross not only a river, but a threshold of trust. In their crossing, they left behind the identity of wanderers and became inheritors. Heaven was teaching them that miracles are not entertainment, but endorsement. When God repeats a wonder, it is not nostalgia, it is verification. The same power that split seas for their fathers now opened rivers for the sons, proving that the covenant is living, not historical. I heard the voice again, "The waters part for the willing, not the watching." Faith that stands at the edge will always see barriers. Faith that steps in will always see paths. That is the law of movement in divine reality. When the final priest lifted his foot from the river, the waters returned, roaring as if awakened from restraint, sealing the passage behind them. There was no retreat, only forward. The land before them shimmered with promise and peril. Yet above the noise of the rushing Jordan, I sensed the quiet authority of heaven declaring, "The time of wandering is ended. The age of conquest begins." In that moment, I knew that every soul who dares to move with God must face their own Jordan, that invisible line between fear and fulfillment, and that the miracle awaits not the perfect, but the obedient. The river still remembers the sea, for both once obeyed the same voice. Every current, every tide carries memory of the command that divided waters and revealed paths. So too does the human heart remember its source, even when flooded by fear or doubt. When faith steps in, the flow reverses. The Jordan becomes testimony that creation itself recognizes its maker. I felt it then, the whisper of eternity through time's current. Step, and the river will remember the sea. The night before the battle, I saw Joshua walk among his people, his face calm but his heart burning with unspoken questions. The city of Jericho stood before them, an iron heart sealed by arrogance, its walls massive, its gates barred. No man among Israel had ever faced such fortification. Yet there was no battle plan, no weapon worthy of stone, only a strange command delivered from the unseen. March, carry the ark, blow the trumpets, and shout when told. It was not strategy, it was surrender. The Spirit said to me, God wins wars not through might, but through mastery over the invisible. Joshua had already learned the law of alignment. He did not seek human certainty. He sought divine rhythm. The people followed, their trust forged through years of wilderness, obedience. I could feel the vibration of the camp, the quiet tension of faith meeting reason. For nothing about this command made sense to the mind. Yet in the realm of spirit, it was perfect. The Spirit whispered, walls are never brought down by stone, but by sound, for every obstacle has its frequency, and obedience is the note that breaks resistance. I watched them rise at dawn, priests bearing the ark, soldiers following, the multitude moving in solemn silence around the city. No arrows flew, no battle cries pierced the air, only the low hum of trumpets echoing like the heartbeat of heaven. Day after day they marched. 6 days of stillness, 6 days of repetition, 6 days of testing. Jericho's warriors watched from above, mocking what they did not understand. But heaven is not moved by mockery, it is moved by motion. Faith does not require explanation to function. On the 7th day, they marched 7 times, and I saw light gathering above them, invisible to the human eye, but visible to spirit. Each step built pressure. Each trumpet blast carried vibration, until heaven and earth resonated in perfect harmony. The Spirit said, when obedience reaches completion, creation must respond. At the final shout, sound became power, and power became earthquake. The walls shattered not from without, but from within, as if the stones themselves surrendered to divine decree. Dust rose like smoke from an invisible altar, and the air thundered with freedom. I realized then that Jericho was not just a city, it was a symbol of the human will. Every wall that man builds through fear, pride, or memory must one day meet the sound of surrender. God's strategy is always paradox. He conquers through stillness, he wins through waiting, he commands action through faith rather than sight. I saw Joshua fall to his knees in the midst of victory, not to boast, but to worship. For he knew that no blade, no plan, no brilliance of man had broken those walls, only the presence of the commander who had once stood before him with sword drawn. The Spirit whispered, what begins on holy ground ends in holy victory. The fall of Jericho was not a story of conquest, but of consecration. The city fell so that a nation might remember who truly leads. The trumpets of the priests were not mere instruments, they were declarations of resonance, sound aligning with will, spirit translating obedience into energy. I could feel the echo of that vibration ripple through centuries, reaching even into the hearts of those who believe that silence and patience are weakness. Heaven has no use for haste, for every act of faith sets a law in motion, and the law of heaven never fails. I asked within the vision, why must obedience precede miracle? And the answer came, because obedience is the measure of trust, and trust is the gate of power. The miracle was not the collapse of stone, but the collapse of limitation. Israel did not merely conquer a city. They conquered the idea that God must act through logic. The Spirit said, Faith begins where reason ends, and the impossible begins where surrender becomes total. I saw the people shouting not just in triumph but in release. Their sound carried the memory of captivity, the fatigue of wandering, the hunger for home. When the walls fell, it was as if centuries of oppression collapsed with them. Jericho was the last shadow of Egypt, and its destruction marked the birth of freedom. I saw angels move through the smoke, marking the victory as complete, for heaven always records obedience as eternal achievement. And I knew then that the battle of Jericho was not won that day. It was won the night Joshua met the commander. For once a man learns to remove his sandals before the divine, every wall before him becomes dust in waiting. The Spirit said, "The power that parts waters can also crumble mountains, but it will never do so for pride, only for purpose." I saw how each generation carries its own Jericho, those towering doubts, those fears disguised as certainty, and that only obedience can make them fall. Not intellect, not force, but trust. The law of heaven is simple and absolute. What resists divine order must collapse. And so it was that Israel walked straight into the city that once mocked them, no longer wanderers but inheritors. The air itself seemed to bow before their passage. I saw Joshua stand at the gate, his eyes lifted, his heart silent, and I understood that this was more than victory, it was fulfillment. The circle of the wilderness had closed. The faith that began with a parted sea now ended with fallen walls, and the Spirit whispered the final truth. Every wall that falls on earth echoes a wall that falls within. When the people crossed the Jordan, manna ceased, and the silence that followed was more shocking than the sound of battle. For 40 years they had awakened to find the white flakes of heaven's provision scattered upon the ground like dew, a daily reminder that God was near. But now, on the first morning within Canaan, the sand lay bare. No shimmer, no taste of sweetness, only the stillness of change. I felt the ache of their bewilderment, the hollow between habit and newness. The Spirit said to me, "This is how heaven matures the soul. What once fell freely must now be cultivated." God had not withdrawn his care. He had shifted his method. The people were to live no longer by miracle but by mastery, no longer by constant rescue but by responsibility. It was a sacred graduation from dependence to dominion. I understood that the ceasing of manna was not punishment but promotion. When the child becomes capable of walking, the parent no longer carries him. God's silence was an invitation to grow. I saw the people searching the ground, hands trembling, eyes wide with confusion, some whispering that they had sinned, others that Moses' absence had ended their favor. Yet heaven remained still, watching, waiting for understanding to bloom. Joshua, perceiving the change, reminded them of the promise. "The land itself shall feed you," he said, "for the Lord has given you not only survival but inheritance." And indeed, the fields of Canaan already bore grain, ripened under the same sun that had once dried the wilderness. The lesson was clear. Faith must now plant what it had once merely gathered. The Spirit whispered, "The same God who fed you in scarcity now teaches you to prosper in plenty." I saw in this the reflection of every human journey. When grace seems to retreat, it has merely changed form. The manna was never the end, only the means. It trained them to trust the invisible hand. Now that hand invited them to work with it. I understood that true abundance begins when man and heaven labor together. Many fear this transition, for comfort loves the predictable rhythm of miracles. But heaven seeks maturity, not dependency. The Israelites had to learn that divine provision is not always falling from above. Sometimes it springs from beneath, from soil, from effort, from partnership with creation. In that silence, I sensed God's approval. The Spirit said, "To stop feeding as before is not to stop caring. It is to reveal that the power once external has now become internal." Their daily gathering had shaped discipline. Now that discipline would produce harvest. I saw a principle forming like light through crystal. God provides not always by sending, but by unlocking. The promised land was never meant to rain manna. It was meant to yield fruit. Each seed hidden beneath the earth, awaited human cooperation. The miracle was no longer around them, but within them. Heaven's economy had shifted from constant deliverance to co-creation. I felt this truth burn in my spirit. For many who walk the path of faith misunderstand divine withdrawal. When provision stops, they think love has ended, yet in truth it has deepened. The ceasing of manna is the invitation to maturity. To live by miracles alone is to remain a child of wonder. To live by principle is to become a steward of promise. I saw that Joshua did not pray for the manna's return. He understood seasons. What falls from heaven belongs to the wilderness, but what grows from earth belongs to inheritance. The people would now taste fruit that had weight, sweetness that came with labor. Heaven had shifted from feeding to empowering. The Spirit said, "When God stops giving what you are used to, it is because He has already given what you need." I realize that many of us stand where Israel stood between the end of manna and the beginning of mastery, fearing the silence that follows change. Yet the silence itself is instruction. The Creator speaks not always through miracles, but through their absence. I saw angels mark that day as a turning point in the covenant. The people who had lived under constant supply would now learn to sow and reap, to govern the ground that had been promised. It was the birth of self-rule under divine law, the restoration of the original design spoken in Eden, to till and keep, to multiply and reign. The manna had kept them alive. Now the soil would make them wise. God's intention was never to sustain infants, but to awaken sons. I understood why the Spirit withdrew the old provision so suddenly. If He had warned them, they would have clung to expectation instead of stepping into transformation. Heaven never explains what must be experienced. Growth is always disguised as loss. The disappearance of manna was not a void. It was a veil being lifted. I saw Joshua looking upon the bare ground with calm eyes, and the voice of the Lord echoed through him, saying, "You have entered a new season. I feed you now through what you plant. I walk with you through what you build. I bless the work of your hands as once I blessed the dew upon the sand." And I knew that this was the true meaning of abundance, not the endless falling of gifts, but the awakening of creative power within the heart of man. The wilderness had ended, and with it ended dependency. From that day forward, the covenant people would eat not what heaven dropped, but what heaven taught them to grow. Before Jericho fell, God commanded a second circumcision, an act that left every warrior weak by human logic, disaster by divine law, purification. The mark of belonging preceded the march of victory. "You will not win because you are strong," said the Spirit, "but because you are mine." Each soul must face this inward blade. Old fear, pride, control cut away. Consecration before conquest. Only the purified can inherit the promise. I have seen enough of visions to know that God does not waste a single ending. Every death, every silence, every vanished miracle is a seed. When I beheld the journey of Joshua and the people, I understood that the story of Moses had never truly closed. The Spirit showed me that the plan of heaven moves as the tide one wave, withdrawing only to feed the next. What was lost in the wilderness was reborn at the river. The man passed away, but the motion of God did not falter. I felt that same motion within myself, the endless rhythm of transformation that guides every soul who dares to obey without proof. Each scene burned into my mind: the mountain where Moses fell, the river that parted, the commander who appeared with a sword of light, the silence of the manna, and through them ran a single thread. Obedience is the bridge between worlds. When I prayed upon this revelation, the Spirit whispered, "What you call change, I call continuity." I realized then that heaven never replaces. It unfolds. The same life force that moved through Moses flowed through Joshua, as breath moves from one lung to the other, never ceasing. Every servant becomes the next sentence in the same divine paragraph. That truth humbled me, for I saw that even in my own work, I was but a single link in a chain stretching beyond comprehension. The hand that wrote through me was the same that guided them across the Jordan. It is one consciousness, shifting forms but never losing essence. I remember asking within the vision, "Lord, why must you hide the body of Moses?" And the answer came, because man must learn to follow the living Spirit, not the memory of the vessel. The holiness of that mystery lingered in me. I saw how men often cling to what once carried God instead of seeking where he now moves. But faith that stands still becomes idolatry. The pattern of Joshua reveals that God does not repeat himself, he renews himself. Each age receives its own river to cross, its own manna to release, its own ground to till. As I watched the people step upon Canaan's soil, I felt time collapse into eternity. Their journey was ours. Every soul must cross its Jordan, must bury its Moses, must meet the commander of light who strips away self until only purpose remains. And every soul must face the moment when manna ceases, when the old ways of provision end, forcing trust to become maturity. These are not ancient events. They are inward stages of awakening. The death of Moses is the death of dependence. The rise of Joshua is the rise of responsibility. The parted waters are faith made visible, and the silent manna is love teaching strength. All of it is one continuous revelation that God never abandons, he only evolves his expression. I carried that understanding back into waking life, and it changed how I saw loss. When something dear ended, I no longer called it death but transfer. When silence fell in prayer, I no longer called it absence but invitation. The Spirit said, "The same light that left one lamp now seeks another. Will you burn for me?" And I answered yes. I saw then that obedience is not a single act, but a rhythm, one step, one breath, one trust following another. This is the eternal motion of faith, the unseen current that carries creation forward. I understood finally why the scripture ends that story, not with mourning, but with motion. The promise did not die with Moses because promises belong to the eternal. God does not bury his word with his servants. He plants it in those who are willing to continue. That night, as I closed my eyes, the vision returned one last time. I stood upon the banks of the Jordan, watching the water glisten with moonlight, and I heard the same voice that had spoken to Joshua whisper now to me, "Arise, for the work never ends." Each soul is both follower and forerunner. Each generation must cross anew. I felt a quiet joy, deep and unmistakable, for I knew that the journey of the Spirit is endless. The wilderness, the river, the promised land, they are not places but states of consciousness. And as the dawn rose over that eternal horizon, I understood what it means to live in the rhythm of God, to move when called, to trust when silent, to yield when lifted, and to know that the divine plan never pauses, it only changes its instrument. In that awareness, every ending becomes peace, every silence becomes guidance, and every breath becomes the next unfolding of eternity.